Okay. Okay. Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. I had the opportunity to meet some of you already, but I'll just say my name is Lee Rensimer. I'm a research associate, postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Education, and I do work on educational interventions and aid flows to education broadly.
I'm Kamna. I'm an associate professor at UCL, which is University College London in the UK, and I am going to bring to bear into this some of my classroom experience. So I've been teaching development studies for about 9 years, most at postgraduate level, but I think that there are some strong lessons that can translate to undergraduates as well.
Right. So yes, today we're going to be speaking to you about using diaries to bring reflexive practices into your classroom. Kamna already mentioned that a lot of it's going to draw on her own teaching experience. We both have experience drawing on reflexive practices in our teaching, but Kamna's been teaching development studies particularly for a good number of years, so we'll be drawing on her experiences. Yeah, with that, I'm going to put a link in the chat window. Where'd it go? There's the chat. Sorry, Zoom window. Hi, sorry.
Okay, so while Lee's doing that, let me just say that rather than waiting for questions at the end, what we're going to ask you to do is to write down your questions in the chat as we're going through, and then we'll continually review it and address them as we're going through the presentation, rather than taking up time at the end.
Yeah.
So just ignore the Mentimeter, maybe, and tell us if, what's the question?
It's not in there.
Have you used reflexive diaries in your practice? Make it.
We're having a Zoom malfunction.
That's no one. Okay, so no one's used this particular technique before. That's fine. We're going to talk in a little bit of general terms about reflexivity and what reflexivity can bring, and then zoom in on talking about diaries as a particular means through which to do that. So can you move to the next slide, please? So broadly speaking, in my experience, students of development tend to be concerned with the real-life application of theories and concepts of equality and well-being. Yet whenever I've looked at development curricula, there are very few opportunities for these future development practitioners to understand their position in relation to questions of inequity. So I use, and you can see the quote there, Antonopoulos' definition of reflexivity as this dynamic interaction between reflection and action with an intention to learn and change. That's stressing the importance of critical self-reflection as a deliberate act that requires students to continually identify themselves as agents and active political actors, operating within social structures that are simply not of their making. So reflexivity as a technique serves as a prompt for students to assess the impact of their identity, their values and their assumptions on others, and to locate the theoretical backdrop to their identity, values, and assumptions. Now, it's important to contextualize that I spend a lot of time in my class talking about development as projects of patriarchy, as projects of whiteness, and as a Euro-American mission to civilize the other. So that's the setup, that's the conceptual framework that sets the urgency for engaging with reflexivity amongst my students. And stressing, returning to Antonopoulos, that reflexivity is this intention to learn and change. And that the process of reflexivity allows us to identify our assumptions about the development project and question them. And once we're embarked on this process of questioning, this development is a choice. So my framing to the students is you, the student, are choosing after reflexive action to be a certain kind of practitioner. Through this setup, I'm able to introduce ideas of positionality, epistemology, and decolonial praxis without necessarily naming them. Now, there are multiple different techniques to prompt reflexivity, and I've used diaries is a particularly powerful one.
Yep.
So how to introduce reflexive diaries. And I'm going to talk through what I have done and refined, a technique that I've refined. So if there are specific ways in which you would prefer to do it, or you might do it, there's tremendous flexibility in this. So I build up to reflexivity in the classroom by giving students readings to prepare them to reflect. These are not readings about reflexivity, but papers that are likely to speak to their specific experiences and desires in entering the field of development studies. So it's picking up on this, I want to help save the world stuff that draws so many students into this sphere of learning. So many of my students speak of doing development or having taken a gap year to gain first-hand exposure to development issues through traveling in the so-called global south, or through a paid volunteering opportunity, like building a school or something like that. So I give them a particularly powerful piece, and the reference is up here by Kate Simpson, on volunteer tourism in development. I ask that when they're reading that article, they think about what they've learnt about the other through their own experience, and ask what this might reveal about how they acquired this knowledge. So in other words, I'm introducing them to ways to engage with epistemology. Having given them this reading and this prep work, I give them a structure, quite a rigid structure to practice and to work with. And I give them a range of different examples called double reflection, double loop reflection. It's easily articulated by Shion, and he's got 4 steps to reflection. The second, you record the observation. So to illustrate, if the action is to interview the recipient of a microcredit loan, then the observation that's recorded is you write your interview notes. The first reflection is reflecting on the action. So then you think about, why did the interview go the way that it did? And then the reflection on the reflection is to interrogate yourself and to understand how the interview unfurled in the ways that it did. So this is bringing in questions of positionality. And it's through this self-analysis of new knowledge that a new situation is produced. And so then behavior change may occur. Now, there are critiques of this particular technique and this 4 steps to action. Reflection is rarely a linear sequence. Reflection can be iterative, and it may take time to process a reflection adequately. But nonetheless, this slightly prescriptive mode I found to be a very useful technique for students unfamiliar with the process of reflexivity. So where I use diaries, I use reflexive diaries. I do so as part of our preparations for an international field trip to a country in the so-called global south. And over the years, so my students are based in London, over the years, this has been to Ethiopia, to Uganda, and Nepal. And so I have my students write fieldwork diaries in the same way that any qualitative researcher would do. And they use this as a primary artifact for then writing reflexive diaries. So the reflective diary is not, on Thursday, I saw this. It's an analysis of what they learnt about themselves as future development practitioners, not an account of what they saw and heard. I use the reflective diary as part of their summative assessment. And I do it so that my students take it seriously and they complete the assignment. Because whenever it's been formative, hardly anyone ever does it. You could attach it to a summative process. You could attach it to an end of year review, or to a particular class or a module or an exercise. Go and conduct an observation in the community. Around reflexive diaries needs a solid framing, so development practitioners, to allow students to focus on something that is meaningful to them.
Right, okay, so our goal in this is obviously to encourage learner engagement and maximize the learning outcomes, which Kamna has identified. But there are some considerations which we need to take into account to maximize that learning and strengthen the reflexivity skills. Firstly, consider the stakes and the risks from the students' perspectives and work towards minimizing both of those. Something low stakes and low risk might might be like an internal only log shared between yourself and student, perhaps. Can you get that back up there? This is the shared screen. Oh. I would say to avoid attaching a grade to it if you can. Now, Kamna does use it in a summative way, but if you do, you could do it as a pass-fail sort of thing to get the students to do it, but avoid performing their diaries for the instructor's benefit. You want it to be an honest and critical self-examination. So that's the gold standard here, right? They're not going to arrive at that, those learning outcomes that you're aiming for if they're writing what they think, what you think they want to hear, or worse, what they're afraid of others hearing. Now, sharing with...
No, I don't know how to use your computer.
Okay.
Sorry.
So sharing with peers might not and probably won't produce an honest self-examination. So if you want to demonstrate how and where they can learn from diary writing, you might consider building up an example bank from previous year cohorts, and then suitably de-identified, of course. But there's also the question of anonymity and how you might use that in this kind of assignment. In the UK tradition, this is the default here, but it can still be applied where there's anonymous double-blind marking is not the standard. So if you use, say, a VLE like Moodle, where there's anonymous submitted assessments, paradoxically, it does actually induce quite a lot of honesty, as their names aren't on it, and they don't know necessarily who's going to be marking it either. So so that there's sort of this double-blind setup going on. Of course, it may be this may be opposite to the relationship you're looking to build with your students, of course. So it depends on how diaries are structured into your course assessment. Sorry, but I'm just trying to get our slides back here. There we go. I beg your pardon. Oof. Right. Okay. And even willful resistance from students. I think it helps to explain the genealogy of reflexive thinking across disciplinary traditions and the ones your class is engaging with, to remind them that you're not making them do this. You're introducing them into a deep train of thought and praxis. So this will vary by discipline or course subject. There's plenty of brilliant post-canonical or even non-canonical sources and scholars you can draw on here to bring the connection alive for your students. If you're teaching reflexivity alongside field research methodologies, you could attach it to a text like Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology or Phenomenology of Whiteness. I think those are both brilliant in the way they employ critical reflexivity as a tool for examination and deconstruction. And also her work, it really centers the way the researcher is embodied and situated. And so that's helpful for students to learn how positionality and gaze works in actual field encounters. So this is also to say that there will be resistance and discomfort from with the assignment. And that's where you as educators who know your students best, would be best placed to judge how to do this kind of exercise by creating a safe space for learners to be both honest and open. Keep in mind that the act of students identifying their discomforts can in part be a learning outcome. So what is it about this process of self-reflection that, other than the fact that it's laborious, that makes them so uncomfortable? And what can you do as an instructor to build up their trust and so they feel uncomfortable engaging with their assumptions with you as their audience? You might consider going down the informed consent route in the same way you would with research participants. You make it explicitly clear what you will do with their diary responses and how you will safeguard their data. Another suggestion, if you plan to use this formatively, which tracks their learning journey, would be to delay introducing it until you have built up some kind of trusting rapport with your students. So not on the first day of class. Lastly, I'll just note that you need to keep them focused. Make sure that they talk about themselves, not other students. It's easier to apply criticality and sociological lenses to their classmates. I mean, this could be extremely insightful or ill-informed, but that's not the point. It's much harder to assess yourself, and that's the objective of reflexivity here. So as Kamna noted, giving them a framing such as what they learned about themselves as future practitioners, will help retain that focus. Okay, so we are now going to involve all of you. We've emailed a Jamboard link to Ellie, which I hope she's received. And Ellie, if you could actually just put that up in the chat room. We have two questions for you to discuss, and this is going to be a task of very small groups for just 5 minutes. And the point is to discuss, would you use reflexive diaries in your teaching, or have you already? And what are the challenges for you to introduce it to your teaching? Obviously, those are connected questions here. Now, the link that we passed over in the chat room is to a Google Jamboard. And if you could, once in your groups, once you've arrived at some of those challenges, if you could stick them as Post-it notes in the Jamboard, we'd love to see what sort of challenges you've identified, and then we can discuss them as a group. So I'm going to hand it over now to Ellie and the team to break you into groups for 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are just starting to get some of your feedback in here. And so on the screen, you'll see the Jamboard. Looks like we have 5 notes so far. If other groups would like to continue adding as we're discussing, go ahead.
Let me pick up on this idea of grading and the assessment, because I see that it was in the chat as well about how do you assess, how do you grade these things? Now, I am very much guided by the things that I have to do for my institution and the marking rubrics that we have in the institution. So there's not a huge amount of flexibility in what makes an A grade paper. So there still needs to be references to academic literature. There needs to be a line of argumentation that's woven through it. There needs to be evidence of criticality and so on for these higher marks. And so I talk students through as to how they can get a high mark. And in obviously the first year, there were no past papers to show them, and students really struggled, and the quality of the diary was simply not as strong as in subsequent years, when with past student permission, I was able to share some of what a good diary might look like, or a higher graded diary would look like. In choosing what examples to give them, I gave them a very wide range of things that students spoke about. And because this was anchored to a field trip, there were lots of there was a tremendous variety of things that people chose to write about. There were, and I'll give you examples in a few moments, there were ideas of going to a market, there were the sensation of the flight and the anxiety of landing in a place that was new to them. People wrote about different things. And so having this very wide range allows students to get a sense of what's the sort of thing that they need to be able to demonstrate without revealing the actual content of what they want to do. It says you've got T minutes left. What does that mean? I'll wait for you to clarify, Abraham. Can we go on to the final slide, please?
Yeah.
We'll go through some of these comments at a later date and give in a few more thoughts. One of the things that I want to pick up on, and what's quite interesting, is where you've all discussed things that you could be doing to make the presentation, to make the diaries effective and as part of your teaching and your learning. What hasn't quite come up, or I didn't see, is the issue of affect. And what does it do to you as the instructor to read some of these diaries? And so I found that there were some incredibly powerful learning experiences for students, and there's an excerpt here on the screen. One student wrote, "I believe that as an African, I was immune to making generalizations about Africa. And a recent extended stay in Sierra Leone left me with this general sense of belonging to the continent. Since I was African, I could not other Ethiopians because I was one of them, but as it turns out, I could, and I was not." There are multiple examples of these really quite deep reflexive practices, but it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the other reflections that I've read that have affected me as an instructor. And, well, you can see me, my camera is on, as a woman of colour too, navigating my own way in racialised, imperial and patriarchal projects of development studies. And one of the things that students wrote, you can see them here, is that my thoughts were pity for these people having to live and trade in such conditions, reflecting on a visit to a marketplace. I realized that this was normal for the locals and they even welcome us with smiles. And there are quite a few of these examples as well. And what it reveals is just the level of magnanimity that is required of instructors, or is expected of instructors, to keep this as a student-only exercise, rather than one that affects some of us greater than others in reading this stuff. Go to the conclusion. So whilst diaries can reveal the gaze of the students on development problems and subjects, I don't see your PowerPoint. Okay, I'm just going to read what's on the text. Diaries reveal gazes of the students on development problems and their subjects, but we need to introduce scope within our programs to reposition their gaze. The challenge, I would say, and has been for me, is to bring these reflections back into a space of learning so that the diary is not the last word. And so the reflection question we wanted to end on was, are you prepared, if you use diaries and where you are thinking of using them, are you prepared? What are you prepared to do with the revelations that come back? And that question that seemed to get a lot of traction of what do you do? How do you know students aren't performing? Well, you don't. In the same way that they perform for every other assignment and write what they think they want you to write. But it takes practice and it takes confidence and it takes lots of one-to-one tutorials to encourage them to write about themselves.
Okay, it looks like we have just 2 more minutes remaining. And we're having, there's our chat window. Would anyone like to call out a question, or would the facilitators identify a particular question they see recurring?
I agree with Hilary. This is about making a safe space of vulnerability. Yeah. It's allowing our students to be vulnerable. But my points at the end was, how do we take care of ourselves in that when you're the instructor and you're reading some quite powerful pieces? And I do this at the end of the academic year, or towards the end of the academic year. And I've had many occasions where I thought, what on earth did I teach? What could I have taught if that's what they're getting at the end of this? Do you want to say anything else?
Okay.
Yeah, they do. Yes, I use it to feed into the following year students, because I only have students for 1 year, they're master students. And so I take those experiences, those lessons, and I use them in the instruction the following year. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.